Way back in April 2021, I made a video about the Muv-Luv trilogy of visual novels, which was basically me praising the things for 40 minutes. To this day, the finale of the trilogy, Muv-Luv Alternative, remains my single favorite visual novel. So I was intrigued when I heard of an anime adaptation of Alternative, especially once it started driving a bunch of traffic to my video. Since I'm a binge watcher by nature, I held off for the time being. I didn't watch any episodes or clips, and I even avoided most of the discussion surrounding the show except for the complaining of a few of my Twitter mutuals. You know who you are. So I'm going in almost completely blind, though I obviously know a lot of what's going on since I'm a fan of the source material. So with that, let's take a look at the Muv-Luv Alternative Anime adaptation. But real quick, if at any point you think I'm doing a good job, leave a like and subscribe to help me in the algorithm. Twitter page and Discord server are linked below, and consider joining Patreon for early access to future content. Alright, enough of that. So since this is my first actual anime review, I should probably go over how I'm going to do this, since this is a completely different artistic medium than what I normally do. As you probably know by now, I like going in depth on the things that I cover, so I want to take on Muv-Luv Alternative in a relatively detailed manner. However, I'm not nearly as knowledgeable about anime as I am about video games and text-based storytelling, so I may not be able to go on about the technical stuff and intricacies of different artistic decisions like I normally do. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to go episode by episode. I'll watch an episode, write out that section of the script, and then watch the next one. So you'll get a good idea of my thoughts and speculations as I'm working my way through the show. I'm writing this intro before I've started watching, so I honestly have no idea how the fuck this'll go. Should be fun though. And if you all end up liking it, I'm more than willing to do the same thing with other series to increase my upload rate between bigger projects. After all, it takes a lot less time to watch 4 hours of anime than it takes to play 45 hours of Chrono Trigger. Let me know in the comments. I'll also talk about this a bit more at the end of the video, so stay tuned if you're interested in that. And last thing before I get started, spoiler warning for the Muv-Luv trilogy of visual novels and season 1 of the Muv-Luv Alternative Anime, which will be spoiled episode by episode. If you haven't already been spoiled, I very strongly recommend reading the visual novels because they genuinely contain some of the best writing I've ever experienced in my life, and the more blind you are going in, the better. You have been warned. Alright, so let's finally get into Muv-Luv Alternative, Episode 1. Episode 1, The State of the World. So here's the thing, the Muv-Luv Alternative Anime is kinda playing on hard mode here. See, Muv-Luv is a trilogy and Alternative is the third and final part of that story. Starting more than halfway through the story is already going to make it very difficult to properly adapt, and furthermore, a lot of the brilliance that went into the visual novel relied on meticulous build-up from the first two parts of the story. See, the visual novels ran on a unique storytelling structure where Muv-Luv Extra was a slice-of-life rom-com where we were introduced to the main cast and got to know them. Unlimited is where the main plot kicked into gear with the protagonist Takadu getting isekai'd into an alternate universe, where mankind is fighting a losing war against an alien threat known as the Beta, where he eventually meets up with this universe's version of his friends and learns to pilot a TSF, which is essentially a mech suit. Alternative begins with Takadu somehow traveling back in time so he can effectively try again after his ultimate failure in Unlimited. It's just hard to imagine starting with Alternative because I feel like without the context of the previous entries, it just isn't going to make any sense. While I understand that Alternative is the most popular part of the story, I don't know if it's really possible to have an adaptation that's both faithful and actually good without also adapting at least Muv-Luv Unlimited. But let's step back a bit. What am I looking for in an adaptation? Well, at its core, an adaptation is simple. It's a retelling of a story through a different artistic medium. And in order to be successful, I'd argue that there are three main factors they need to go for. Firstly, it should tell the same story. If you're going to adapt a specific work, fans will be expecting that story. Maybe not one-to-one or anything, but any significant deviations should have a solid frame of logic behind it, or you might as well make it a spin-off. Looking at you, World War Z. Secondly, it has to actually be good rather than simply coasting off the interest of fans. While I understand that almost any adaptation of anything will have its fair share of fan service, I feel like an adaptation has failed if it can't stand on its own merits as a work of art. And lastly, I feel like an adaptation should be a good entry point in the franchise for new fans. When you take a story from one medium to another, you're exposing it to an entirely new set of potential fans, and it needs to be understood that much of this new audience will be unfamiliar with the source material. And if it can effectively serve as that entry point, it and the source material will have a synergistic effect where fans of the source will engage with the adaptation, and fans of the adaptation will engage with the source. Ultimately, that means more fun for the fans and more money for the creators. Everyone wins. So after watching episode 1 of Muv-Luv Alternative, how is it doing so far? Well, for starters, it actually started out in a way I honestly didn't expect. Believe it or not, our protagonist and the main cast of characters haven't even been introduced yet, and this episode is pretty much entirely dedicated to setting up the premise of this alternate reality. It showcases the Beta attacking and ultimately taking over the Sadagashima military base in Japan, with our pseudo-protagonist being a soldier named Kamaki. So I have to say, I actually really like this approach. Given that the story basically has to carve out its own structure due to the starting point, I think it was a great decision to immediately hit the audience with the beta to really showcase their threat. Because it's one thing to say that the beta are a threat to humanity, but it's very different to show their raw destructive power in action. And it actually does a really good job setting the tone of the story moving forward. You see named characters die violently during the fight. You see people sacrificing their lives to protect their homes. You get this feeling of hopeless fatality that has everyone in its grip. But it also does a good job of showing that the beta are a threat as a collective, and you can see that while each individual creature is dangerous, they are by no means invincible, and with skill and coordination, even the mountainous Fort class beta can be killed. It's just that their sheer numbers are overwhelming, and one wrong move will get you killed. Actually, let's talk about that a bit. So in the visual novels, it's explained with an in-universe exposition dump that TSF mech suits exist because the sheer destructive capabilities of the beta meant that even their most heavily armored vehicles would be destroyed in seconds. So they opted to design war machines that specialized in mobility rather than durability. Now the anime doesn't have this big exposition dump, but I think it does a decent job of showing it. They have a pretty solid showcase of each of the different types of beta, and they do also show how one good hit from a beta will just completely fuck up a TSF. I don't know if the logic will necessarily get through to an anime-only viewer, but I do think it at least succeeds in making it all feel like a natural part of this new world. The combat sequences themselves were, I'd say, serviceable. They certainly didn't blow me away. The animation wasn't super impressive, the choreography wasn't anything ridiculous, but it did its job well enough and I certainly wasn't bored. I did however like how the Fort class beta would have their joints explode and spray blood all over their face when they were about to go down, and I do think they did a decent job of showing the threats posed by the different types of beta, like the aforementioned Fort class behemoths, the defense class living siege weapons, the laser class artillery, and so on. I'd say that an anime-only viewer would probably walk away with a decent idea of what the beta are capable of, despite the lack of outright exposition, and I do have to give props for that. As far as artistic design, I'm going to talk about that more once we meet our main cast, which I'm guessing will be in the next episode, but I do want to say that I like that they were pretty faithful with how the beta themselves looked. I always thought that they were creepy as all fuck, and yeah, even in anime form, they're still creepy as all fuck. They definitely sold the monstrous inhuman nature of the beta in their visuals. I was mostly unimpressed with the soundtrack so far. Not to say that it's bad or anything, but it feels like pretty generic stuff for the time being. That being said, I did like the metal song that played when the TSFs first engaged the Fort class beta. I think it really fit in well, and I absolutely loved how it transitioned from its more melodic segment to screaming as the Fort class started to fall. I ultimately couldn't find the song itself or even so much as the song name. Even after a bunch of searching around, I couldn't really find very much info on the show's music. Hey, future ads here. I didn't want to rewrite this section of the script since that would go against what I'm trying to do here, but I did want to clarify something. I did eventually learn that the primary composer is Evan Call, but I'm not sure if the rock music is from him or if it's licensed. Also, the soundtrack does eventually grow on me, so don't be too angry in the comments. Alright, back to the video. So instead, I'll show you a clip from the episode and hopefully I won't get slapped with a copyright claim. If I do have to cut it out, this episode is actually on Crunchyroll's YouTube channel and I'll leave a link to that in the description, timestamped to the part I want to show you. Just take a look at this. Hey, future ads here. The audio isn't playing nice with my editing software, so just check the link in the description. Last time you'll hear from me, I promise. So the episode ends with the beta taking over the place, killing a shitload of people and injuring almost everyone else. Our pseudo-protagonist Komaki survived, and under orders from her commander, who is dead by the way, she helps with rescue operations and with evacuating the remaining civilians as the beta continue their conquest and establish a hive on the ruins of the old base. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised by how the show kicked off. I had a pretty damn good time with it, and while I can't say it's anywhere near perfect and certainly doesn't hold up next to the visual novel at this point, it's doing a decent job so far, and I think the fact that they sped up the pacing a bit was ultimately a good decision considering the shift in medium. I probably won't talk as much about future episodes since this video would be fucking 2 hours long if I did, but I do feel like I had to do my due diligence in setting everything up for you all. So again, I'm actually pretty happy with episode 1 and I'm curious as to how they'll handle Takeru and his place in the world. Let's move on. Episode 2, A Repeating World. Okay, so episode 2 takes place 3 years after the previous and serves as the introduction to our protagonist Takeru. To get this out of the way before I start talking about the episode itself, now that we actually meet our main cast of characters for the first time, let's quickly go over the new visual design. I'm going to be perfectly honest here. I really like the unique artistic style of the original visual novels. I feel like the look of the original characters just oozes personality, and from the time I first saw a teaser for the anime, I wasn't too thrilled. The characters themselves were generally kind of flattened out. They removed the distinctive hair vents that just about every female character in the VNs had, and the colors in general were darkened except for Miki's bright pink hair. While I don't think the character designs are bad in a vacuum, and I think I actually prefer anime Takadu to VN Takadu, I feel like giving these more generic designs to characters who already had absolutely fantastic designs was such an odd decision. Also, I'm kind of annoyed that they didn't make Miki look like a cat in the anime, because I feel like her over-the-top cutesy design really fed well into the overall juxtaposition of her harmless appearance and cute mannerisms, with the fact that she's arguably the most capable soldier in the main cast. It's not a major complaint there, but again, I feel like asking, why do what the VN did, but worse? I know a lot of people really like to complain hard about the character design of the anime, and I'm not going to say it's the worst thing in the world or anything, but ugh, I just don't care for it. Especially when compared to the original, which I think looks amazing. They also have a different voice cast from the original visual novel, and while I do kind of miss the original voice actors, I can't really find any fault with the anime cast, and I think they did a pretty good job. It's also worth mentioning that I actually really didn't like Takadu's voice actor in the visual novels. Nothing against the man himself or his performance, I just thought his voice really didn't fit the role, and I feel like anime Takadu works a lot better for the character. So moving on from that, let's talk about the episode itself. Since as I mentioned before, this story starts as part 3 of a trilogy, a lot of the episode focuses on basically catching the audience up with the story up to this point. They explain the basic events of Unlimited, where Takadu was yoinked from his original world to the world with the Beta, and how humanity was basically overwhelmed to the point where they used their 5th and final big plan from what was known as the Alternative Project. Alternative 5 was simply to evacuate a few 100,000 people to another planet while the remaining billion or so were basically left to die. So Takadu travels back in time 2 months before the point of no return, remembering most of what happens, though with some gaps in his memory. So it's established that he wants to help the military base's top researcher Yuko Kozuki complete Alternative 4, thereby preventing Alternative 5, by rising in the ranks as quickly as possible so he can be as useful as possible. I feel this mostly serves its purpose as far as getting everyone caught up, but it does feel a bit scatterbrained, and I think an anime-only viewer might have trouble getting things to stick, but I'm not sure what else they could have done considering the circumstances. We also meet the main cast, but we don't really get all that much from them, though we do get a decent sense of their personalities from the limited amount of dialogue they have in this episode. We see Chizuru's uptight attitude, Miki's bouncy excitability, Meia's duty-focused pragmatism, and Kei's mischievous playfulness. It's all fine, and as long as they build off of it, I have no major complaints here. Most of my actual problems with the episode stem from the fact that they're stuck with this stupid structure they decided to take for the story. I know I've already talked about it, and I'm sure I'll be bitching throughout this entire video, but starting with Alternative makes no fucking sense. It just skips too much of the story, especially when you're limited to 22-minute episodes. They basically had to condense an entire visual novel's worth of story into less than half an hour, and by necessity, they cut out some of what makes it good. And at the end of the episode, they had a bit of one-on-one time between Takadu and Meia to start out with their friendship, and they called back to the volcano scene from Unlimited. Now, this was a very big deal in that story and served a big purpose when it came to the philosophical questions the VN asked, as well as a deeper exploration of both Meia's and Takadu's characters. But of course, in the anime, it lacks all that emotional impact and ultimately just feels like it's there as nothing more than a cool reference, which really just comes across as a big slap in the face to the original scene. But at the same time, the volcano scene was referenced as if the audience could actually draw a connection to it. And let's be clear here, the visual novel fans absolutely will, but the anime-only viewers will not. Maybe this is a one-off thing, but I have a sneaking suspicion that this might be indicative of the future. I really hope I'm wrong, but I feel like the story might end up basically assuming that you already read the visual novels, which would be a real shame. And the fact that they didn't even mention Takadu's childhood friend Sumika yet, despite her being one of the big mysteries that Takadu is trying to solve, is a bit of a red flag. So I have concerns, but I haven't lost my investment yet, and they could absolutely turn it around in time. I'm still having a good time, and I do really want it to do the visual novel justice. Here's hoping. Episode 3, What You Want to Protect. Okay, I've got very mixed feelings about this one. This episode focuses mainly on Takadu's desire to change the future, a bit on his internal reasoning for why he's so invested in the world, and plot-wise, the story moves up to the point where the group completes their practical evaluation, which will allow them to finally learn to pilot TSFs. So let's start out with what I liked. This was the first episode in which we get to properly meet Kasumi, who is this shy, adorable, bunny-looking girl and who is a very important figure in the Alternative 4 project. I know it's only been a single episode, but I really like how the anime portrays her. In fact, out of all the characters we've met so far, she's the one I feel was adapted the best. Her design fits the new art style while still being true to her character. Her mannerisms feel like they fit perfectly with what she's all about, and I think her voice actress did a pretty damn good job as well. I also like how they're starting to showcase Yuko's arrogance and conniving nature a bit more, which was something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way in the previous episode. See, a big part of her character is the fact that she's a genius and knows it, and that she has this almost Machiavellian way of using those around her to achieve her goals. And to be clear, even though I'm a massive fan of the visual novels, I don't want to fall into the "that's different from the source and therefore bad" style of critique. speak. I just don't think that holds any water on its own. However, I really loved how the visual novels portrayed her as an incredibly powerful ally, but an incredibly unpredictable one. I feel like stripping that aspect of her character, like I was afraid was happening in episode 2 of the anime where she seemed like a benevolent but skeptical figure, would have been a big mistake. But they're starting to hint at her more devilish nature, and I'm hoping they can follow up on that. So now let's get into something I'm starting to get very concerned about. The more I watch, the more I think that they really were not keeping new viewers in mind. There were several instances throughout the episode that were direct recreations of scenes from the visual novel, and several callbacks to the events of Muv-Luv Unlimited that just don't have any precedence in the anime. For example, when Takeru was speaking to Yuko regarding Kasumi, there was a short flashback to the end of Unlimited where Kasumi is all upset and calls Takeru Takeru-chan. Now this goes hand in hand with the rather ham-fisted way they inserted Sumika into the story because the anime just didn't talk about her up until this point. See, one of the big driving mysteries in the original Unlimited and Alternative is that Sumika, Takeru's childhood best friend from Extra, was nowhere to be found. Kasumi served as a bit of a red herring, and it was heavily implied that Sumika had been turned into Kasumi or something similar due to the shared mannerisms and the fact that Kasumi and Sumika are literally anagrams of one another in English. The scene in Unlimited where Kasumi calls out Takeru-chan was really big because that was very much a Sumika-specific thing, and it also came at a very emotional point in the story. The thing is, in the anime, it does not have the same weight to it, and from the perspective of an anime-only viewer, we've only just met Kasumi, so we don't really know anything about her. The anime just includes this moment from Unlimited, exposits the whole Sumika thing in a line of dialogue, and then immediately draws that connection between them in a clear attempt to include these important plot elements that just would have been pretty much impossible to achieve organically. And this was far from the only nod to the visual novels that would have made no sense to an anime-only viewer. Like, they pretty much just lifted the naming scene where Takeru adjusts the way he wants to address his friends to line up with how he talked to them in Extra. So he called Chizuru class rep and referred to Miki as Tama. This was a very funny scene in the visual novels, both in Unlimited and in the reprisal version of the scene in Alternative. But without having really seen the group interact with one another, and without knowing that's how Takeru has always addressed them, it just kind of falls flat and just feels like fan service. And also, I've noticed that a lot of the things relating to Takeru knowing the future are handled in a way that probably feels like incredibly lazy and sloppy writing to anyone unfamiliar with the visual novels. See, there are plenty of instances where Takeru will be like, oh yeah, this happens today, such as the introduction to Mikoto. Or there's the moment where Takeru tells Yuko about an attack by the beta that he knew about from his time in Unlimited. In the visual novels, this was all set up, and these moments were basically relying on the reader looking back and saying, oh yeah, I remember that scene, which all felt incredibly natural and really just worked. Here, even though they more or less lifted these moments straight from the visual novel, without that foundation, it feels like the writers were just making shit up as and when they need to. It's not what they're doing, but that presents in the same way as when other writers just make shit up in other stories, and I feel that the Muv-Luv Alternative Anime isn't doing a great job in adjusting for the fact that they didn't also adapt Unlimited. And the last thing I need to discuss here is that despite literally being a quarter of the way through the season, we've barely had any proper interaction between Takeru and the group. Chizuru, Miki, Maya, and Kei all feel like unimportant side characters when they're really supposed to be the primary supporting cast. Mikoto is in the same boat, but because she was literally just introduced, I'll give her a pass for the time being. As I watch more of this show, I can feel my initial optimism slowly starting to die, but there's still potential there. I can see some moments of genuinely good stuff, and even though I still think it's impossible to properly adapt the story from the starting point of Alternative, it could still be an enjoyable experience. Of course, I've seen what people are saying about it, so I'm not expecting it to turn around, but I'll give it a fair shake. Let's move on. Episode 4, Companion. Okay, I actually liked this episode. It certainly wasn't perfect, and I do think it still suffers from the unfortunate structure of the show as a whole, but I think this one was pretty good. So plot-wise, it mainly focuses on the crew's finally starting to learn how to pilot TSFs, Takeru's interest in getting everyone else up to speed as quickly as possible, and at the very end, they had a big reveal of the fact that the timing of certain events is starting to differ from Takeru's previous experiences, and the fact that the military base was at one point a beta hive. So the episode starts out with everyone at the beach celebrating their successful evaluation, and it's basically poking a bit of fun at the anime industry and its incessant need to include a beach episode in almost every show. Now, I know not everyone will appreciate that, but I do love dumb little bits of meta humor, especially when it doesn't full-on break the fourth wall. And Muv-Luv as a whole likes to play around with common anime tropes, and it almost seems like the writers challenged themselves to try to make them fit naturally in the story purely for fun. Now, it's not a beach episode, it's just a quick 2-minute scene, but I found it amusing. Sorry, had to get that out of the way. Now, I quite liked the action sequence where Takeru was going through the training simulation, and it did a good job of being entertaining while also showcasing Takeru's skill at handling TSFs. See, as is explained both in the visual novel and in the anime, Takadu has a natural advantage in piloting TSFs due to the similarities between them and a fighting game he played back in his original universe. This natural talent, combined with the many hours of practice from Unlimited, allowed him to be the most skilled rookie in history in Alternative. I think they sold this pretty well, and they also did a surprisingly good job of explaining this skill and tying it to his knowledge of fighting games. I'll be perfectly honest here, I know I said that I'd be giving the show a fair shake, but I was fully expecting them to kind of fuck that up. And credit where it's due, I'm pleasantly surprised. I also feel like the scene where it's revealed that certain events are happening earlier than expected was also handled pretty well. They announced a visit from the UN Undersecretary. Takadu freaks out saying that this was supposed to happen after they started live combat exercises, and then he runs to Yuko to tell her that the HSST, it's not explained what this is in the anime, is going to fall from space and pose a threat to the base. It all flowed surprisingly well, and it was handled in such a way that it all made sense even without the original context from the visual novels. See, in the alternative visual novel, that moment hinges a lot on the reader's memory of that very crisis from Unlimited, and I expected it to be just another, by the way, this is about to happen kind of thing in the anime, but it followed a proper path of setup and follow through. It was actually pretty good. I also liked how they started showing that the squad is more than warming up to Takadu and they've got his back when it matters. However, we still haven't gotten any solid moments with them to actually witness this bond form and strengthen. I mean, aside from that one scene with Maya back in episode 2 and a few scenes of everyone being wowed by Takadu's skill, we have no real reason to internally believe that they've grown to be close friends with mutual respect. At this point, the anime is very much telling us this without showing us, and I think that's a real shame because the bond that these characters form is an integral part of the story moving forward. Additionally, certain plot points in the future will be exceptionally hard to sell to the audience if they don't accept this almost familial bond these characters have. Plus, I feel like the bond really needs to be solidified before the squad eventually joins up with Isami's Valkyries because those bonds become important, and it'll be incredibly hard to do it justice if they still have work to do on the main cast of characters. And let's not forget that we have a lack of prior context due to the show starting out with Alternative, still a very stupid decision, and that the medium necessitates a faster pace than the visual novels, meaning they can't dedicate extended segments to individual characters like they could in the visual novel. Can it be pulled off well? Yes, but it will require a lot of care by a team of incredibly skilled writers, and I'm not sure that the anime's writing team is capable of it. Not that very many people are, mind you. Again, the anime is basically playing on hard mode here. And lastly, I have to reiterate how much I'm annoyed at how little they've talked about Sumika so far. If you haven't read the visual novels, just understand that I cannot overstate how fucking important she is to this story, and the anime just hasn't given that dynamic any real consideration. So far, we see Sumika for about 3 seconds in the OP, and she was very briefly mentioned in episode 3. And here in episode 4, we very briefly see Sumika in a flashback where Takadu remembers teaming up with her to play that fighting game against Mikoto and Maya back in his original universe. These short flashes absolutely do not help the anime-only viewers have any sort of connection to her, and that really sucks because so much of what comes later in the story hinges on all that residual love and care for Sumika pushing Takadu to fall head over heels for her in a very short time. If they don't establish that closeness, it will not work. In the anime so far, Sumika is portrayed as just another one of the group, and that just isn't right. She's his oldest and dearest friend. And even in the Muv-Luv Extra visual novel when going down another girl's romance route, Sumika is still a very special person to Takadu, and they remain close friends who would gladly give their lives for each other. I really hope the anime corrects its course because episodes like this one show that the series actually does have some potential. There are very real redeeming qualities, but I hold serious concerns about the long-term implications of a lot of its structural decisions. If it continues as is, even though the individual episodes may well end up being very good, the story is going to fall apart, the emotional moments won't have any impact, and any central themes will be utterly lost. I really hope I'm wrong, but I'm not banking on it. Still, if I am wrong, I will happily eat my words. Let's move on. Episode 5, New Power. Okay, so I didn't hate this one, and I'm kinda having trouble putting my thoughts into words here. This episode has some real good in it, not a whole lot of stuff that was outright bad, but I'm honestly not sure what my takeaway is. So let's just talk about it and see where that leads us. This episode starts out with the visit from the UN Undersecretary, who just so happens to be Miki's father, and then transitions into a mock battle where the squad is facing each other in teams of 3 in order to test the new operating system for the TSFs that Yuko had designed with Takadu's input. So you should have realized by now that I generally like to start with positives because I genuinely want to treat the anime fairly even though I am admittedly biased against it due to my love of the visual novels. So let's start out with the visit from the Undersecretary. I fucking loved it. This was a goofy, funny scene in the visual novel, and I think the anime fucking nailed it. I loved how the undersecretary went from stoic military bureaucrat to sappy doting father in the blink of an eye. I loved how the group was bantering back and forth when Miki revealed that she lied to her father about being the squad leader. I was giggling like an idiot when Miki was just losing her shit while her father laid bare all the trash talk she'd been doing about the others behind their backs. It was clear that they were having a lot of fun when making this scene, and honestly, I think this was my favorite moment from the anime so far. It was beautiful and I had such a good time with it, which was a nice change of pace since I watched it right after I finished scripting that rant in the last part of the video. And I also think that this one scene did a better job at showcasing the bond between the group than the rest of the show so far. If we get more fun scenes of the group genuinely acting like friends, both in the care they show for one another and in the fact that they're close enough to bicker from time to time, my previous concerns might not bear fruit. Still, it could go either way, but this is hopefully a good sign. The rest of the episode was just kind of okay. Didn't blow me away, didn't completely bore me. I thought the battle was kind of fun. I'm still not super impressed by the animation, but it did its job well enough and the scene itself was pretty engaging. I hate to give such a wishy-washy take, but I don't think it stands out enough to say anything interesting about it. Now, another thing that happened is it seems that they must have realized that they almost completely forgot about Sumika up to this point, so they recreated a scene from the visual novel of Takadu giving a Christmas present to Sumika back when they were both young children. It was a cute scene and it actually does take some steps to make the audience realize that these two have some serious history. But I mean, in isolation, it doesn't do all that much, so I really hope they continually reinforce it. Like the bond between Takadu and the squad, one good scene is not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. Though it has to be said that Koichi Kamiki, who voiced Takadu in the anime, just can't do a child voice. Puberty has locked off that pathway for him, and it's jarring when you hear a grown-ass man voice coming from a character who's supposed to be like 9. Honestly, they should have just gotten a different voice actor for child Takadu. Not like that's never been done before. It's just one of those things that completely kills immersion in the scene and I just don't get it. I also feel like they kind of forgot that Mikoto wasn't introduced with the rest of the cast because we've gotten literally zero characterization from her. Not that the others got all that much except for Miki at the beginning of this episode, but Mikoto is currently a big old question mark if you haven't read the visual novels, which is a real shame because she's such a fun character and I feel like the anime only viewers aren't going to be able to properly appreciate her. That being said, a mysterious man appears at the very end of the episode who, spoiler alert, ends up being Mikoto's father, though that's probably going to be revealed next episode. So maybe they'll use this introduction as a way to properly introduce Mikoto to us because God knows she needs it. Now, as far as the episode overall, I have to reiterate what I've been saying. There's definitely potential here, but aside from a few moments of great stuff shining through, the anime is simply not living up to its own ambitions, and it certainly isn't doing the original any justice. I really do hope it picks up, but so far the anime is shaping up to be thoroughly mid. But again, I'll be as fair as possible and hold out hope that they can seriously step it up. Episode 6, Transfer Experiment. Alright, so let's get things moving a bit because I'm going to have to talk about some pretty crazy shit later on. Getting it right out of the way, as I mentioned in the last section, the mysterious man at the end of episode 5 was indeed Mikoto's father, and he's basically a high-ranking spy. It's clear that he is intrigued by and suspicious of Takadu because it's been very strongly hinted at several points that this universe's Takadu was killed at some point. I suspected that they might use Mikoto's dad as an excuse to give her some characterization, but I was wrong about that. The closest we got is like a line of dialogue about her being a tomboy and a very short scene where we see her trapping a bird for food. In that scene, she also happens to see Kei receive a mysterious note from a mysterious stranger. This becomes its own thing later in the story, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Mikoto's dad also explains that there's political turmoil going on and hints at a rebellion coming from a group of people looking to overthrow the Japanese government. This had its own arc in the visual novel, and based on future episode titles, I'm guessing that it's going to be tackled in the near future, so I'll hold off on that for now. The rest of the episode focuses on Takadu's ability to connect with both his original world and the alternative world, and they finally take some time to convince the audience that Takadu actually gives a shit about Sumika. It still needs work, but they showed some nice bits and pieces where Takadu will dream about the time they spend together. He tears up a bit when he talks about her, and there's one scene where Takadu was in his original world for a few seconds, but you can see Sumika entering his room all fluffy and happy, and man, I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me feel things. I'm not entirely sure how an anime-only viewer would take that scene since my experience is very much colored by my knowledge of the source material and I just can't extract myself from it completely. However, I feel like the clear happiness from Sumika, the bright color palette of the scene, and Takadu's emotional reaction probably do a fine job of conveying the intent of it all, even if it may not evoke the same visceral reaction as it did in me. Now, this episode starts to introduce us to some of the crazy metaphysical sci-fi shit that I love about Muv-Luv. So for starters, Yuko explains that the observation and willpower are two integral parts to how this thing all works. Takeru's willpower can manipulate reality, and with a little technological help, that willpower alongside the other universe sort of pulling him back as it has a natural tendency to push toward equilibrium, can allow him to travel back to his original universe. She also explains that Takeru's tether to the alternative world is based on what she calls cognizance. His cognizance of the universe and the universe's inhabitants' cognizance of him are keeping him from slipping away, of course aided by his strong desire to save this world before returning home. Now, this is something that I fucking loved about the visual novels. See, this actually ties into the Schrödinger's cat thought experiment, which is real-world theoretical physics, and cleverly ties both main interpretations of the concept into its own rules, resulting in a surprisingly robust hard sci-fi system. See, Schrödinger's cat is a hypothetical in which a cat is locked in a box along with some science shit that has a 50% chance of killing it, and the idea is to explore the nature of reality and how it interacts with possibility. And to be clear, I don't even remotely understand the technical details, but there are two primary schools of thought. One theory is that of many worlds, which has been pretty wholeheartedly embraced by sci-fi in general, where you have parallel universes that represent every single combination of what-ifs. You probably know it as a multiverse. So with the cat, reality will branch off into two existences, one where the cat is alive and one where it's dead. I don't think I have to explain how that ties into Muv-Luv unless you're like really stupid. The other interpretation is that while the cat is locked in the box, both possibilities are simultaneously true as long as the outcome is not observed, so the cat is both alive and dead. Once it's observed, the web of possibilities collapses and a single outcome is locked in. So to tie it into Muv-Luv, Takeru is simultaneously aware of two entirely separate realities, and the people in these realities are aware of him. This is why he stuck around in the new universe rather than bouncing back to the old one. The mutual observation of his new existence tied him to this new universe. This is all really neat stuff and I love it. In the visual novels, a lot of this stuff is explained, but a good deal of the details are left up to the reader to figure out. For example, with all the Schrödinger's cat stuff I just talked about, the general multiverse stuff along with the willpower and observation stuff is explained, and they go into a bit more detail about how the rules of Muv-Luv really do line up with the many worlds theory. The thing is, I just so happen to know the very basics of Schrödinger's cat, so with a bit of additional research, I was able to actually tie in these real-world ideas to the sci-fi rules of Muv-Luv, and it's honestly one of the smoothest instances of suspension of disbelief since many of the minute details line up with reality, or at least with hypotheses made by real-world scientists. The introduction to these ideas in the anime is exciting and done pretty well for the most part, and I hope they can sell that same intrigue I had with the original visual novel because it's really fucking cool. And it seems like so far they're staying pretty true to what the visual novel did, so I'm excited to see it progress further. So the end of this episode has Takeru visiting his old universe so that he can obtain a formula from this version of Yuko, who is Takeru's physics teacher, that will be integral to the completion of Alternative 4. There's a nice wholesome scene between the two, and Takeru agrees to give her 3 days to compile all her info, at which point he'll come back and collect it. The episode ends as he's walking away both happy to have visited, but extra determined to complete his mission in the new world. Overall, not bad. Again, it suffers from the exact same structural issues, but I don't feel like it's possible for the series to ever truly escape that pitfall without some seriously brilliant writing that most people, even professional writers, are simply not capable of. Still, I actually think this episode did a decent job, and it's starting to move in a direction where many of my issues from earlier might be resolved as time goes on. I'm still not happy that they waited this long to give us any proper emotional connection with Sumika, but I'm at least glad that they didn't forget it completely. So like before, there's potential and redeeming qualities to be found. You could still very much go either way, and if you've watched my videos, you'll know that I tend to see the good in things. I'm an optimist to the point of dumb fuckery sometimes. So even though the logical part of my brain isn't expecting much, I'm still kinda hopeful for the rest of the series. We've still got the second half of the season, so let's move on, shall we? Episode 7, Promise. Alright, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is another episode that I actually quite liked, though it suffers from all the same structural issues that undercut the genuinely good stuff it has to offer. This episode starts at the end of Takeru's trip in his original world, mainly focuses on Takeru and Kasumi, and then teases the upcoming Civil War arc. So with the universe trip, the one thing of note is that we actually get a proper in-person meeting with Sumika. Like the bedroom scene from before, I feel like this is something that will only invoke an emotional response if you're a visual novel fan, since we just haven't seen enough of her for an anime-only viewer to really internalize the bond they share. Nonetheless, the little cues that take place in that scene, as well as explicit dialogue where Takeru explains that he misses her, all help to make sure that the audience at least logically understands what's going on. Like I've said before, it's good but not nearly enough, and I think their lack of focus on Sumika prior to this point is really coming back to bite them in the ass. The visual novel was able to get away with it because they had an entire slice-of-life story where Sumika was a prominent feature. The anime doesn't have that luxury, and so it needs to find another way to really drive that point home, and I don't know if they'll be able to pull it off at this point. Moving on from that, the Civil War stuff is coming soon, and that's exciting because I really liked that arc in the visual novel. But while I'll go into that more when it really kicks off, the important thing here is that Takadu finds the letter that Mikoto saw Kei receive, and he also notices a lot of other sealed letters in her room, and it ends on a cliffhanger where Kei basically tells him to back off because she doesn't want to kill him. Now here's the thing, I actually wasn't a huge fan of this development in the original visual novel. Not that it was bad or anything, but I just don't feel like it was as good as everything else, so I'm not particularly excited for its portrayal in the anime. But we still haven't gotten a lot of interactions with the individual group members, so for an anime-only viewer, Kei is probably still a huge question mark. Without the context of previous parts of the story, it's really not possible to see past her aloofness into her more caring and playful side. I mean, Kei is basically the definition of a kudera, and that's not really something you can successfully half-ass. It's a character type that takes some time to really set up, and the anime simply hasn't laid the groundwork for any of them, much less Kei, who requires more work than the rest. And I think that's going to really blow up in their faces sooner rather than later. I just don't see how they're going to dig themselves out of this one. Yuko also explains a bit more about Alternative and how Alternative 1 to 3 were all attempts to communicate with the Beta, with Kasumi coming from Alternative 3, which was where the military used selective breeding and genetic engineering to create psychics who would be able to read the minds of the Beta. They discovered that the Beta are sentient but don't consider humans to be life forms. And Kasumi was now a crucial part of Alternative 4, though Yuko is stingy with the details. She's also responsible for keeping Takadu tethered to this universe while he's visiting the old one. All fine stuff here, and I have no real complaints. The bulk of this episode was a one-on-one between Takadu and Kasumi, and honestly, this is the type of thing that still does give me residual hope for this series. Because when they slow things down and let the characters just interact with one another, it gets genuinely good. It was really nice to just see the two talk, to watch as Takadu taught Kasumi how to play Cat's Cradle, or listen in as the two watch the sunset together and talk about their inner thoughts and desires. We actually start to see Kasumi open up, and I already said that Kasumi was handled pretty damn well, and fortunately that statement is holding up. Now, I don't know how much control the creatives had as compared to the executives, but I think if they were to take the time to really focus on the characters more and they had an episode primarily focused on each of the main cast like they did with Kasumi here, the series could have genuinely been great, because it's clear that these people aren't incompetent. While I understand that being as meticulous as the visual novel would have been impossible, they seem to be speeding it up without really compensating for the bits they miss. But this episode with Kasumi shows that they could do it, and I'm a little sad because I think the series could have been really good if it was only handled differently. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I expected this show to just be terrible, and I think I could have handled that. But to see mediocrity that could have potentially been brilliance just kinda hurts. Because I know what this story is capable of, and while I like parts of it, it's not quite hitting the mark. I know I'm sounding far more pessimistic than I usually do, but still, I'll see it through and hope and pray that I'll be forced to eat my words. Let's move on. Episode 8, Turmoil in the Imperial Capital. I'm starting to run out of ways to phrase this exact same sentiment with every episode, but this one had a few really solid moments that I'm just not convinced are enough to save the series as a whole. So as the episode title implies, this is the start of what I called the Civil War arc, though it's far more accurately just a single coup d'etat. Now, I really like the opening scene that played before the OP. It's the shortest one of the series so far, showing the rebel soldiers executing the Prime Minister of Japan and his cabinet. No prep, no dialogue, just fucking harsh, and it was great. If you've been watching the video up to this point, I think you can guess what kind of things I'm gonna like about this episode. Yep, there were a few really nice scenes where two characters are allowed to just talk. And we're finally starting to get a bit more from some of these characters, which, as I've discussed ad nauseum, is something that is sorely lacking in the series so far. There are 3 of these moments in this episode. The first is after news of the coup is given to the squad, where it's revealed that Chizuru's father is the prime minister who was just killed, and she and Takadu have a short exchange where she's visibly upset, but you can see that she's simultaneously steeling herself so as to accomplish her duty, and also starting to lose overall hope as she says that she has nothing left to be worried about. It's all fine stuff assuming they build on it, which they'd better fucking do. The next is a scene between Takadu and Kei where it's revealed that her father was a commander who was imprisoned for desertion because he prioritized evacuating civilians rather than engaging in combat. The leader of the coup was a soldier under his command who greatly respected him and remained in one-sided communication with Kei even though she never actually read his letters. The scene between her and Takadu showed her feelings of guilt over potentially being able to prevent the conflict had she not pushed the letters away, but also reaffirmed Takadu's trust in her. Again, this is all good stuff and is a good starting point for future character development that I doubt will be properly utilized. Additionally, as I mentioned before, while I like the overall story arc, I wasn't a huge fan of Kei's involvement. But that was because I didn't feel like Kei and the coup leader's conflicts effectively mirrored the conflict between them in the other universe, unlike how many of the other interpersonal conflicts within the story as a whole did. So this is actually one instance where I feel that the anime could actually come out on top. Will they? Doubtful, but it's certainly possible. And the last of these moments came with Maya. Now this is the second time we've really gotten a chance to examine her character on a deeper level, and it's definitely paying off, and we can see the complex relationship she has with her own sense of self and her sense of duty. Now, Maya is actually the twin sister of the Japanese Imperial shogun, which in this alternate reality still exists even after World War II. The details haven't been revealed in the anime, but it's pretty clear that due to Maya's relation to the royal guard that there's a connection there. But let's not forget that Maya is not a Japanese soldier but a UN one, so she's very conflicted. She has her duty to the UN and as such is obligated to oppose the coup. At the same time, the coup was driven by a genuine care for Japan and the belief that the political leaders had abandoned and abused the people, and she understood their point of view. And even further than that, she felt an obligation for her sister and was determined to stand by her no matter what. So there's this nice scene towards the end where Maya is in a very emotionally turbulent state, but she and Takadu just talk it out and allow that weight to come off her chest. It was nice solid character work, and this series desperately needs more of that. The rest of the episode is stuff like mobilizing to deal with the threat, a few new pieces of political intrigue, that kind of thing. And I'm sure you're expecting me to talk about it, but this was all just staggeringly mediocre. Not particularly good, but not bad enough to be interesting. And that's how a lot of the show has been so far, a mostly middling experience but with these brief spikes of genuinely good storytelling that may or may not be muddled by the overall lack of care for the anime-only viewers. I don't have anything more to say about this episode. Let's move on. Episode 9, Battlefield. Okay, so this is probably going to be the shortest segment in the video so far because I honestly don't have all that much of substance to say here. So the end of episode 8 had the squad deployed as a backup in the conflict with the coup. The capital was pretty much overrun and fighting had broken out between the rebels and Imperials. The shogun had escaped the palace but purposely allowed that information to be leaked to draw the fighting away from civilians. She meets up with the squad, who are then tasked with getting her the fuck out of Dodge and bringing her back to the military base while the rebels are closing in on them, while also showing themselves to be highly skilled combatants, making their way for the various defense lines far faster than expected. So basically, this episode is a big chase sequence. So I'm going to lead with my conclusion here. This episode is pretty boring in my opinion. There's some action which, like the others, didn't blow me away, though I can at least acknowledge that the action in this show is actually pretty good on a purely technical level. Most of the episode is really just moving the plot along without all that much underlying substance to it. Like, it's fine and it keeps the audience in the know, but it really isn't anything to write home about. I mean, they did have the notorious "English can eat shit" line from the visual novels, which got a smirk out of me. And there were some positives. For starters, I should mention something I've noticed for the past couple episodes but wasn't sure when to mention it. I'm actually starting to really like the soundtrack. More and more often, I'm really vibing with the music they pick for the more intense scenes, and I really wish I could find some music credits somewhere. I'm not actually going to show you what I mean and open myself to copyright claims even further, but the end of this episode here is a really good example. I really like the rock music in the background as Takadu is desperately trying to escape as the American reinforcements engage the rebels. If you're not planning on watching the show for yourself, definitely consider at least checking out the end of episode 9 just to see where I'm coming from. We're also briefly introduced to Isumi's Valkyries, who I'm guessing will be more of a season 2 thing, but these are fantastic supporting characters who really carried their weight in the visual novels, so it's nice to see them here even briefly. And as mentioned earlier, we meet the Shogun, who is Maya's twin sister. She's another great character, and I don't feel like her scenes in this episode really do her justice, but the bulk of her showcase is likely coming in the next episode, so I'm going to hold off on that point for the time being. Still, we do get to see her determination and concern for the well-being of others in this scene. But yeah, the episode was pretty boring overall. Not terrible, but certainly not doing the source material justice. I'm 3/4 through the season, and I can't believe I'm saying this about Muv-Luv, but I'm kind of ready for it to be over. Let's move on. Episode 10, Resolve. Okay, so this episode has a few neat things, though it ultimately gets the same verdict as the last episode. It just seems to be moving forward in the plot, but without a lot of the meticulous setup of the visual novels. So it's not like I can really even point to anything super wrong about it, it just seems like the show is going through the motions. So I have to reiterate that the overall lack of attention they've given to Takadu's squad is really starting to fuck with everything around them, because aside from Maya, we've at most gotten one short conversation with each of them as far as seeing how they are beneath the surface, and we've still gotten absolutely nothing about Mikoto aside from a single throwaway line from her father. Literally nothing else. These are incredibly complex characters in the source material, and for them to be stripped down to NPCs feels like a slap in the face. Things are going down in this episode, but we don't have a solid foundation for what is going through anyone's mind except for Takadu and Maya. Like, I feel like an anime-only viewer has no real attachment to any of these people and probably wouldn't have any reaction aside from shock if one of them were to be suddenly killed off, and that's just such a waste. The visual novels are legitimately masterpieces, and it really sucks to see that almost none of what made them so brilliant has made its way to the anime. I know it's not entirely fair of me to be constantly holding the anime to this borderline impossible standard all the time, but that's a risk you take on when you adapt a well-loved piece of media. It's the same story, but it's just not doing any of the things that made me and countless others fall in love with it in the first place. So while my critiques of each episode are starting to all boil down to, yeah, it's kinda boring, understand that this is not any one bad thing each episode is doing. It's the result of an overall lack of due diligence in building up these characters and the underlying themes of the story, while also failing to properly compensate for the fact that they didn't also adapt Extra and Unlimited. I said earlier in the video that this could all come back to bite them, and I think it's really starting to show. It's not an explosive dumpster fire, but a slog through mediocrity. But that being said, there are a few things I did like about this episode, and I do want to talk about it. Firstly, we got to see a bit more of Isami's Valkyries in action, and need I remind you that I fucking love them. They are incredibly badass, and I was definitely getting some emotional reactions during their feature, even though I know that's likely from my visual novel experience. We also see one of them die in combat, which evokes a variety of emotional responses from the others. Everything from a temporary lack of functionality to an almost nurturing personality to harsh pragmatic stoicism are on display. And I actually thought those brief looks at these characters, who for all intents and purposes are cameo roles for the time being, were pretty faithful to these great characters. We also got to learn a little bit more about the rebels, namely that the coup was not just a selfish power grab, but the result of well-intentioned but ultimately misguided hypernationalism. And as I briefly mentioned before, this whole thing was spurred on by legitimate grievances with the government and concerns over other nations potentially undermining Japan's sovereignty. It's all good stuff, and I'm definitely a fan of morally grey antagonists. I think the anime handled this aspect of the story quite well. And another neat thing was that one of the top soldiers in the rebel fleet, who remember are all elite soldiers who are highly skilled, was actually Kamaki from all the way back in episode 1. I think this is a really neat decision, and I need to point out that I'm fairly certain that Kamaki wasn't actually in the visual novel and instead was introduced in the manga adaptation, which I have not read. And I do like her use here. She was a very sympathetic pseudo-protagonist back in episode 1, and we know she's a good person, so we can use that familiarity to enforce the morally grey nature of the rebels, while also being kinda shocked by her transformation from meek rookie to intense and domineering fanatic. Good shit. There's also a scene where Takaru is ordered to sedate the shogun, who is suffering from extreme motion sickness. This is a normal thing, though it does come with some risks, and Takaru is conflicted while the leaders in the various military factions, those being the UN, Japanese Royal Guard, and American, voice their disagreements with one another. This was a very big deal in the visual novels, but I don't think the anime really sold it very well. But then again, it would be hard since it plays off a lot of the thematic buildup that the anime quite simply couldn't have replicated in the allotted time. And then the rebels get the drop on them, and instead of attacking, offer an hour-long ceasefire, stating they only want the shogun and don't want to fight. Basically sets up a cliffhanger to get the audience to come back. Not much to say there, but the upcoming bits were incredible in the VN, and I hope the anime doesn't blow it. So yeah, you already know what I have to say here. A few good pieces that were unable to compensate for the flawed foundation of the show as a whole. Let's move on. Episode 11, Each Other's Thoughts. Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts about this episode, but really all of them kind of boil down to the same overarching message. So this episode has 3 main plot points. There's the meeting between Miki and Irma, a Finnish woman fighting in the American army. This was this whole big thing in the visual novel where they promised to one day visit Finland together once the Beta are pushed out of Europe. And this promise, alongside other underlying things with her character, forged the basis of her character arc moving forward. And while I think this scene was handled alright, because we lack all that foundation that these moments are meant to build upon, it just doesn't hold any real sway for an anime-only viewer, and fans of the source like myself have to basically subsidize the lack of due diligence with our experience with the visual novels. And I know I'm just repeating this over and over again with each episode, but it's gotten to the point where this thing that I said might end up being a serious problem all the way back in episode 2 has grown into this insidious force that overpowers anything else the show tries to do. There isn't actually all that much I have to say that's negative about the episode itself, because in fact, I actually think it's quite good in a vacuum. Had I watched this episode without the context of the rest of the series, I'd probably give it nothing but praise. It's just that the series as a whole is coming apart at its seams, and I don't care how well they pull off each individual plot point or story element, that just won't be enough to save this show on a structural level. And that's why it pains me to talk about this next scene, which is where the shogun gives a speech to all the soldiers, thanking the Americans and bowing towards them, which is like a really big deal in Japanese culture. Under normal circumstances, someone with that level of clout would never show deference to foreign soldiers like that. Respect and gratitude, sure, but not deference. Then she gives a personalized message to each of Takaru's squadmates, praising Chizuru's father as a loyal servant to the nation, assuaging Miki's residual guilt that her father's globalist tendencies may have stoked the flames of this rebellion by telling her that she's following an honorable path, reassuring Mikoto that her father is a good man and that they will see each other soon, repeating a phrase that Kei's father liked to use and describing him as her mentor, helping Kei deal with the feelings of shame that accompanied her father's imprisonment. I really loved this scene in the visual novels. In fact, it was probably my favorite scene up until the squad eventually joined up with the Valkyries. And I felt so many of the same emotions watching this scene in the anime that I did while reading it in the visual novel. I think this scene was adapted exceptionally well. But then we have to consider those who have not read the visual novels, the anime-only viewers, because they are just as legitimate of an audience as I am. The anime did not properly lay the groundwork for all the turbulent emotions running through these people. In the visual novel, every one of them had this complex web of grief, guilt, shame, anger, and confusion, and at most, the anime gives us a surface level look at that, and in some cases not even that much. Mikoto? This scene was really well done, and I genuinely can't find any kind of significant fault with it on its own, but it's completely held back because it just isn't supported by the rest of the series, and that sucks. People are gonna watch this episode, say, that was pretty good, and just not see why it's such a powerful, moving moment in the story. Also, this moment was probably the biggest single moment showcasing the exceptional benevolence and wisdom of the Shogun. This one scene originally solidified all that was great about her character, and it just doesn't quite do the same in the anime, and that's not even the fault of the scene itself. These things don't exist in isolation, so they can't carry the show on their backs. The scene eventually transitions to the Shogun wanting to negotiate directly with the rebels, though Maya volunteers as a body double and Takadu volunteers to take her in his TSF, mimicking the manner in which he was originally escaping with the Shogun. Maya had been meticulously groomed for this, so when she meets up with the rebel commander, who let's not forget has pure intentions, she basically rolls a nat 20 persuasion check, but right as he's about to surrender, like mid-sentence, fighting breaks out and it all begins to go to shit. Irma was apparently the one who fired the first shot, though shortly before she was violently convulsing, so she may not have been entirely under her own control. Oh, and it's also heavily implied that the Americans used a plan to escalate the conflict, thereby justifying their presence in Japan. Which admittedly does sound like something our government would do. You know my conclusion here. Good shit, but the Foundation fucked it. There's one episode left which will presumably put an end to the rebellion arc and close off the season. Again, I'll give it a fair chance, but I'm not expecting all that much. Episode 12, Fate. Honestly, I feel like I really don't have all that much to say about this final episode that I didn't already say about episode 11. Even my conclusion is pretty much the same. In a vacuum and with my prior experience of the source material, this was a pretty damn good episode. But without the groundwork this series so desperately needs, there's just nothing there for the anime-only viewers, and I think that's really sad. This episode, as I predicted, saw the end of the rebellion arc. After the negotiations went to shit, there was a big conflict. It's revealed that there's a traitor in the American ranks, though he ends up getting killed off. It's revealed that Irma was indeed under some sort of external influence where she not only couldn't control her actions, but was unaware of them. When she's told that she's the one who started the fighting, she's so shocked that she's unable to avoid incoming fire and is killed. And eventually, the rebel leader is able to kill the American commander before being killed himself by Tsukuyomi, head of the Royal Guard, who is a really fun character in the visual novels, but is just another set piece in the anime. The leader dies, but he and Tsukuyomi show each other mutual respect before the end, and once he's down, the rest of the rebels surrender and order is restored. All fine. It tells the story effectively, though it suffers from those same systemic issues that I mentioned. The rest of the episode is kind of a bittersweet reflection period. While the conflict has ended and there seems to be a stronger sense of unity overall, just about every major character has to deal with some sort of loss and grief as they try to move forward. Chizuru finally gets to visit her father's grave and properly mourn. The rebel leader was like a brother to Kei, and even though she didn't agree with his actions, his death hurt her. Miki had to deal with the loss of her new friend Irma, and she vows to visit Finland for her one day. Maya is mourning the continuing loss of the sister she was never allowed to properly meet, though the gift of a toy they shared as infants brings some comfort. And Mikoto is arrested by the military police, presumably because of her dad's shenanigans. Not particularly compelling next to the rest, but to be fair, the visual novel didn't handle this bit amazingly either. And even the Valkyries had to mourn the loss of their squad mate. And this was all done behind a speech from the Shogun, lamenting the conflict, sympathizing with the rebels' frustrations, and calling for future unity as the nation attempts to heal. All in all, a great scene that stirred up a lot of emotions in me, but you know where my issues lie. All the power of this scene and the episode as a whole comes because the episode does a great job of paying off non-existent setup. With the context from the visual novel, it's wonderful, and I feel they transcribed it to this new medium effectively. But the anime itself does not provide that setup, and because of that, it's the equivalent of telling a joke but only the punchline. It really does frustrate me because there are so many instances where I watched this show and said to myself, this could have been so good. There are individual moments of brilliance where I feel they really captured the magic of the original visual novels, but it falls apart on a structural level and it makes it a very poor excuse for the story of Muv-Luv Alternative. And I almost wish it was just bad, because then at least it wouldn't be so frustrating and I could just meme on it. But moving on from that, there's a post-credits scene where the squad graduates from being cadets and Yuko is doing her mysterious scheming shit and setting up some of the big boy events from the rest of the story, including a brain inside her laboratory. I'm actually not going to spoil that for you on the off chance some of you are new to the franchise and are potentially interested in the visual novels. There's some really neat stuff that happens with that. But yeah, decent teaser for the next season, and while I'm not a huge fan of them undermining the otherwise bittersweet and emotional end to the season, but it's whatever. So way back in episode 1, I said that an adaptation should accomplish 3 things. So how does the Muv-Luv Alternative Anime hold up? Factor 1 was that it should tell the same story. At that, the anime succeeds. It pretty faithfully detailed the major plot points of the first big arc of the original story. Though it missed out on a decent amount of the messages underneath the surface, I feel it ultimately does tell the same story as the source material. Factor 2 is it must be good on its own merits. As mentioned many times already, the anime suffers from severe structural issues that ballooned out of control as the series progressed. But there are moments that are genuinely good. I can't say that the show doesn't have redeeming qualities. In terms of overall quality, I'd say it's pretty middling. Nothing amazing, but not the worst thing you'll ever watch. Factor 3 is that it must serve as a good entry point to the franchise. In this, the anime utterly fails. They showed absolutely no consideration for new fans, and not only is nearly all the subtext completely lost in translation, I feel like there will be instances where new viewers will be completely confused without the context from the source material. This absolutely should not be anyone's starting point with Muv-Luv. So let's answer the real questions. Did I enjoy my viewing experience? Despite all my complaining, I'll admit that I had a decent enough time with it overall, though if I wasn't making a video, I'd probably have dropped it about halfway through. It had its moments, but it's not enough to give me any kind of intrinsic motivation to keep watching. Should you watch it? If you're new to the franchise, absolutely not. Stay the fuck away. I would very strongly recommend reading the visual novel trilogy. I understand that it's a big time commitment, but this IP contains some of the best writing and some of the most meticulous structural decisions of any story I've had the pleasure of experiencing. Yes, the trilogy takes roughly 100 hours start to finish, but I promise it's worth it. But if you've already read the trilogy, should you watch the anime? Well, I can't really answer that definitively. It's ultimately going to be down to the individual. If you're a total Muv-Luv junkie and have already consumed every spin-off, every side story, everything the franchise has put out, it may be worth a watch, just to appreciate the good it has. If you're a more casual fan, you might get some enjoyment out of the anime, but I'd say you could safely skip it. So with all that out of the way, one big question remains. As you may or may not know, Season 2 of Muv-Luv Alternative has been announced. Will I be watching it? As it stands, probably not. Unless the series takes a massive and abrupt shift in its very structure and design philosophy, I don't see it escaping the massive hole it dug itself. Could it theoretically happen? Yes, but will it? I'm not betting on it. Now, while I currently don't plan on watching Season 2, there are a few situations where I would. Firstly, if it does manage to address the major issues I have with it and actually start to do the visual novels justice, I'll absolutely pick it back up. And I've got enough friends in that corner of weebdom that I will hear about it if that's the case. And secondly, if there's enough demand from you, the audience, by the time the final episode of Season 2 drops, I could definitely be convinced to give this video a sequel. Be sure to make your voices heard in the comments when all of Season 2 is public if that's what you want. But assuming no major developments, I think I can safely put the Muv-Luv Alternative Anime to rest. And one last thing before I say goodbye for now, as I mentioned way back in the start of this video, I want to know what you thought of this video, its format, and just generally what you think. This was my first anime review, and I have to say I had a great time with the viewing and scripting process. It was a challenge, but one I enjoyed immensely. In fact, I would be both willing and interested to make anime reviews a regular feature on this channel for a few reasons. First, it's fun. Second, an anime review takes a lot less time to make than my typical gaming and visual novel videos, so I could dramatically increase the flow of content on this channel while still giving myself time to work on my bigger, more time-consuming projects. Seriously, despite this being an hour-long video, it took me less time to go from zero to finished script than it usually does to even finish a game or visual novel. I wouldn't have even gotten to the end of my first Chrono Trigger playthrough at this point. And third, my anime repertoire is embarrassingly small for a channel that specializes in weeb shit. I would like to watch more anime and really immerse myself in the culture more. Despite the great weeb friends I've made, I still feel like a bit of an outsider in my own sphere, and the promise of content would be a great motivator for me. This is something I want to do, but you, the viewers, are an important part of this channel, and I want your feedback. Do you like this idea? If not, is there an alternative you would like? And if you do want more, what animes should I watch? I'll probably do what I did here and do a video per season of any given anime. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I may even do a poll on my community tab, and if I do, I'll link it in a pinned comment. This could be a new chapter in the ads channel, but I won't do it if everyone hates the idea. Well, I've finally said my piece. Thanks for watching. Huge thank you to my patrons, especially my God tier supporters Spawn, Bulk Squat Thrust, Michael Rotolo, Drago, and Fatima. You're all wonderful and I appreciate everything you do. Consider joining them for a shout out in every video and early access to future content. Don't forget to like and subscribe for algorithm purposes. Follow me on Twitter for updates and other antics, and join the Discord server linked below. I'm more active there than any other server, and we've got a solid group of people. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more.